Okay, I think we're ready to begin. Good evening and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird and I am the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby in particular for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that our next event will be next week on Thursday, March 10th at 7:30, not 6, 7:30 p.m. to discuss Maggie Nelson's new book, On Freedom, 4 Songs of Care and Constraint. She will be in conversation with Professor Wayne Kostenbaum. Please mark your calendars and register for this free event on the Leon Levy website. And if you have not done so already, please register your email address on our website so you can be notified of our future events. But tonight we are here to celebrate the publication of Nicole Rudick's biography of the artist Niki de Saint-Phalle, who lived from 1930 to the year 2002. The very long and intriguing title of her book is What is Now Known Was Once Only Imagined, an autobiography of Niki de Saint-Phalle. Rudick will be in conversation with our own Dan Nadel, a current Leon Levy Fellow. Please look for all these books online at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. By way of brief introduction, Nicole Rudick is a critic and editor. Her writing on art, literature, and comics has been published in the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, the New Yorker, Art Forum, and elsewhere. She was managing editor of the Paris Review for nearly a decade. She is the editor most recently of a new edition of Gary Panter's legendary comic, Jimbo, Adventures in Paradise, New York Review Comics 2021. Dan Nadel is a current fellow at the Leon Levy Center for Biography, and he is curator at large for the Manetti Shrem Museum of Art at UC Davis. His recent books include Peter Saul, Professional Artist Correspondence, 1945 to 1976, and It's Life as I See It, Black Cartoonists in Chicago, 1940 to 1980, which accompanied his 2021 exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. Chicago Comics, 1960 to now. Nadel is writing the biography of the celebrated and controversial cartoonist Robert Crumb. Dan will now steer the conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the chat box below to type in your questions, and Dan will be sure to get to as many as he can. We'll try to end this program after about 1 hour. And again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. Dan, I now turn the rest of this evening's event over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Kai. And thanks to the Leon Levy Center for Biography for this and so many other great events. And welcome, Nicole. You're on the hot seat. This is Nicole's beautiful new autobiography of Niki de Saint-Phalle. I highly recommend it. Nicole, this is an unusual and unusually beautiful book as biography. And you outline some precedents in your really moving and insightful introduction. Most notably Ruth Sker's book on John Aubrey, which took his own words to tell the story of his life. You've done something even further here, which is made a biography in words and images, all by the artist. And so I wondered first how you chose this subject, and then also how this subject chose this particular form that's really unique to you.
Niki was someone that I came across at some point, maybe when I was in high school or college. As I say, and I think the forward, she was in someone else's story, but she was sort of immediately appealing. Her name, the fact that she was French, but also I think probably undoubtedly some of the work that I saw of hers were the later, possibly the Nana. So something that was very colorful also would have been really appealing to me. But she was sort of, I don't know, in the back of my mind for years until I sort of determined to do something more with it. And again, I thought about making this book for ages before I really did it. And in terms of the form, Sker was such a great model for me. I found, I had already decided the form the book was going to take, but finding her biography of Aubrey was so fortuitous. She writes that Aubrey saw himself, more as a collector than a writer, that he collected these fragments of fact that would otherwise be lost if he didn't record them. And she says of his own biographical writing that he never made the sort of oblique hints that other biographers relied on to tell the story of their subject. He stuck to the frame of the fact of, the frame of the fact, or sort of the anecdote, whatever was at hand. And so that's what Sker did in her own biography of Aubrey, staying true to his sort of sense of things in the way that she addressed his life. And I kept her book on my desk when I was putting this together because there were times that I started to doubt whether it was going to work. And so I would always refer back to her book and just sort of page through it and remind myself again, yes, like you can do these sort of unusual forms and it can work. And I'm, sort of, I guess, a fan of unusual forms of writing anyway. So the idea of staying true to the way that Niki thought about her own life while also fleshing out that story was very appealing to me. And once I'd looked through exhibition catalogs of her work, I started to hear her voice in them. So then it was just a matter of bringing these sort of disparate works together and seeing what else was there to help tell that story and have those works kind of talk to one another in the form of the book.
So what does her voice sound like to you? Because it's a visual voice mostly. She's writing, I mean, there are typescripts, of course, that you reproduced and also that you transcribed, but a lot of it is her writing in pictures, more or less, which is a unique form as well. I mean, there are a few artists who have done it like that. H.C. Westerman wrote letters in pictures and diaries in pictures, but very few. And so I wondered about sort of how that functioned for you as well. And could you trust it? Could you trust the difference between a typescript and a pictorial letter, essentially?
Can you trust the difference? That's an interesting question. I don't know. Some of the works were typeset. But handwriting was clearly a form of drawing for her. And if, drawing was a way of thinking, then I think that handwriting was an extension of that. I mean, I say that it's probably my favorite work in the book. It's such a great illustration of that. I find it.
The alphabet?
Yeah. I don't know right where it is. But she wrote, here it is.
Good.
You see that? So on the one hand are the drawings, on the other hand is the sort of alphabet where, as I say that the animals sort of recall the letters and the letters the animals. And so I saw, I think there's a deep connection between the way that she was making images and the way that she was writing things. And so there are a couple texts in here that we did reproduce. So she wrote Death and Resurrection by hand, and sort of reading her handwriting feels like looking at an image at the same time. And the book that she wrote later in life in the 90s, My Secret, was also handwritten, but it was done in French. So because we translated it, we had to typeset it. But those texts, I think, are so, those texts in particular are so personal. And for someone who found drawing so essential to her life and to her sense of well-being, I can't imagine her not recording them in her sort of, I don't know, pictographic handwriting.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting kind of vocabulary that she developed, because she sort of comes of age in her artwork in the early 60s with shooting paintings and assemblages, and then gradually, pretty quickly, kind of finds this incredibly bright and sunny vocabulary, almost faux naive, but of course she's incredibly sophisticated and very wise and very, very ambitious. So I wondered about like the directness of the handwriting and the sunniness of the graphics. Does it sort of, do you think it partly covered up what was beneath? Because often in her writing, she's actually really writing about quite dark and highly personal topics.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you square that, this sort of sunny sensibility? And people, I think, sometimes mistakenly think of it as sort of an artifact of the 60s, but it's really something else entirely. It's her own way of rendering and thinking, and she's saying things that are really quite personal and not of that kind of commercial language that people overlay on top of it. How do you square that?
Well, I think that the reader has to read deeply, and not only the words but the images, in order to, as one would with any art, I think, in order to sort of really glean the complexities. And one has to consider the book in total, not as a series of individual artworks. It's got to be thought of holistically, and thinking about the way images recur and the way that they change. So these sunny images, they're not uncomplicated either. The drawing for the Tree of Liberty, which comes toward the end, lists, for instance, a series of demands, which is really basic needs, like the freedom to leave, or the freedom to govern your own body, freedom of speech, the freedom to grow up without violence. And there it is. I mean, that she designed those words to be sort of inset in this beautiful sculpture covered in mosaics and mirrors doesn't lessen their urgency. So yeah, she has lots of these sunny images, but I think if you really are sort of paying attention to what's going on in them, they're much more complicated than you might initially think.
Yeah, that's kind of I think that's one reason why she's been somewhat kind of obscured in contemporary art history, is that it's too dismissible somehow for kind of the discourse after, say, 1965 or something. Like it appears too simple, but actually it's more complicated than it is straightforward.
Yeah.
And I wonder, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I thought about, in the show at PS1 here, at the very end, there was a short video where she narrated a kind of overview of her career. And it, I went to the show a few times and met with some different people, and they all loved that last film because you can hear her voice. And I think it was surprising. But, aside from sort of the timbre of her voice, I had already heard her, in a sense, through the works in the book. And I loved that you could, in the writing here, as in the film, that she's, thoughtful and funny and, severe and enthusiastic, and that the sort of, her randomly capitalized words and her exclamation points, all the wonderful idiosyncrasies of her writing, they're also true when you hear her speak. So I never felt a disconnect between, the way that she was writing, the way that she expressed herself in writing and in conjunction with images, and the way that she actually sounded.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because one thing that struck me about the book is that she writes to friends in the exact same way that she writes to the public. So there's two things about that I think are so wonderful. One is there seems to be no divide between the private and the public artist there, and how she communicates. And two, it's such an incredible gesture. There's a real generosity of spirit about her art, but then just physically, when she sends a letter to a friend, she's in essence sending an artwork to a friend.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a whole other kind of communication, a whole other kind of giving. And I wondered about this generosity of hers. And I think you kind of see it play out in the fact that she spent most of her life trying to create these public spaces for people to play in and meditate in and deal with and encounter. And that, how do you make sense of that as sort of an artistic pursuit and as a sensibility?
Do you mean putting her life into public art in that way?
Yeah, just the generosity of it, that you could send an artwork in the mail and construct a park. Both. And I wonder if they're sort of linked.
Yeah, I think that they are. She said that she didn't want anyone to be excluded from her work, and I think there was a way in which, she enjoyed sort of the childlike aspect of it, and the idea of play, and certainly the idea of collaboration. So creating communal spaces was so much a part of everything that she was about. And I think that there are certain things about herself she didn't put in the work, but of the things she did, she made those private things public and used sort of the same pictorial language to talk about all of it. Like in the 70s, she started using these, she made stickers of certain images in her work and using templates for her letters. And these are letters, so there's a sort of a combination of letters in the book. Some of them are what I was in my mind thinking of as art letters, which were letters that were not meant to be sent. They were meant as artworks. And then there are some in here that are actual letters. And let me see if I can find an example. There's of the they're great. Here's one where, lots of them would say, salute at the top, and then she would sort of fill in the name of whoever it was going to. And she's got these stickers, and there's a feather stuck in the middle of them. And there were so many like this, you would see these stickers coming around, and she would write, letters around them. And there's another one. Let's see.
Why do you think she took the letter form as a way to make artwork? I guess I didn't realize that was the case, that some of the letters were just sort of art for the public. What was that?
The handful in here that are that start with a frontispiece, these are, these were not actual letters. And they're wonderful because in each one of them, she addressed a topic in her art. So she wrote to Pontus Holton, who was a curator and a great supporter of her work. She talked about the shooting paintings, and they were so perfect for filling in different parts of her career in here. She talked in one of them about getting land for the tarot garden. Why did she, I think it's a way of thinking through things. She kept certain diaries, and you could see her pulling from those and putting bits of text into other work. So I think that she was really thinking through a lot of things. And I sort of well, this is getting sort of off the topic of letters specifically, but, you know, I think that maybe in part, she introduced writing to some of her images because she worked in that flat two-dimensional style. And she says that she couldn't draw any other way. That was the ways that she could draw. And so they become very, you know, like pictograms. And I sort of wonder if she started writing around them to say what they were, because they're so, you know,
Define them?
representative. Exactly. And then she found a way to tell stories through them. There are these certain prints that are in here that they look like comics, you know, she's numbered them and you're reading through and she has images for them.
Yeah.
And so I think that constantly writing was a way to think through how she was feeling. And because it was so closely tied to images, they make sense together.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So when let's back up a little bit. You decided to do this book. You went to San Diego to the archive.
Mm-hmm.
And did you find unexpected things? I mean, at what point did you start thinking, well, I'll draw from these letters to this person, and I'll draw from these artworks, these prints that were made, you know, in editions, and I'll pull from private diaries, and I'll pull from personal letters. Sort of, how did you start to make your selection so that you could have a coherent narrative? Because I mean, the beauty of the book for the audience out there is that Nicole in the beginning says straight up, you need to read this from front to back, which needs to be said, because if you flip through it, you think, oh, this is an art book with some words. you know, okay, I'll start in the middle. But it really does read as a narrative, and it reads as a narrative through different kinds of text and images and handwriting, artifacts. It needs that narrative pull. So how did you start pulling that together? And when did you realize that you were gonna tell people, start at the front, wise guy?
I always imagined that that's what the book would be. I had thought initially that I would, you know, go and interview a bunch of people and sort of, I don't know if I'd quite figured out what those interviews would do, I guess give a fuller sense of it. But you know, when I came to understand, you know, when I went to the archive, I had already had some works that I knew would make sense in it. But when I went to the archive and found, you know, a lot of unpublished writing, and then, you know, writing that had been published, you know, in, for instance, like one German catalog that was now out of print, like all of this stuff that was out there, but that just hadn't been brought together, because she produced so much work. I mean, an incredible amount of work. The other thing is that when I got to the archive, there was a binder full of these interviews, sort of precisely what I had imagined doing. And, you know, they were all asked the same. They were meant to be a record after Niki's death of people's memories of her. But you read so many of these and you start seeing like all these different versions of her, you know, as it would be with anybody, where, you know, everybody knows a different version of you. It's like your telephone voice, where you get on the phone and all of a sudden you sound like a different person than you do just normally. So there were all of these different versions of her, but none of them were from her point of view. And I didn't want to lose or dilute or even sort of question the narrative that she herself had written, the story that she was clearly, you know, putting together in different ways. She had written 2 memoirs that went up, you know, that ended at the point where she, you know, in 1960, where she left Harry Matthews and really became an artist. And then, as I say, like her life was in her work after that. So I don't think that she ever intended a book of this kind, but certainly the pieces were there. you know, I think that her voice can carry the narrative because she was always aiming for something big, and her drive to accomplish work was powerful. It, you know, filled her life in a profound way and really defined it. And I see very little separation between that drive to make art and the way that she lived, which means that so many of those feelings, those whole variety of feelings are in the work, you know, in a way that I think isn't typical for very many artists. When she was, you know, the story she tells of living inside the Empress while working on the tarot garden, the Empress is, you know, huge sculpture of one of the tarot cards, and she was living in it, like an apartment in it. It's such and I think an apt metaphor for the way she lived in relation to her art. She was within it, and it was within her. And while I think that she, you know, certainly left some things out in this sort of work, you know, so there are things that are not in this book, you know, for instance, like the day-to-day isn't there, but I think I have the sense that sort of the core of her is represented, the sort of, you know, her artistic spirit, you know, the full sense of it is there. The difficulties, the anxieties, the joys, the, you know, the problems. And she thought through things by drawing and later by writing. So it just always made sense to me that this would be it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very particular kind of biography because it is, as you say, it's a sort of biography of the core of her in a way. And it's a biography that necessarily, by the nature of its sources, leaves things out, which is, as all biographies do. Did you ever feel, were there moments when you felt, oh, I just need to insert my voice here to tell about this one thing because she didn't, and it's important, and people, I mean, were there moments where you had to kind of sit on your hands in that way?
Yeah.
Or do tell.
It was hard not to, because I do have opinions about her work, and there were, you know, what's that?
I'm kidding.
There, you know, there's such fascinating things, but you put, you know, talking about two different parts of her work, it's very exciting, and I want people to see that, but there was no place for me in that story. And I actually had a version of what became the afterword, where I started to, I guess, doubt that that I'd given the reader enough. I thought maybe the reader was going to want something more concrete. And so I wrote this chronology of her life, very, very flat, sort of fact-based. And then I filled it in with like quotes and anecdotes and all this sort of extra stuff that wasn't in the bulk of the book. And I sent it to Lisa Pearson, my publisher, and she wrote back and she said, "You're doing exactly the thing you didn't want to do." And that's all she had to say. And I knew exactly what she was talking about and that she was right. And so I stripped it out because I think the reader doesn't need it. I mean, I think I trust the reader to make the effort to do it. It's not the kind of book where things are laid out sort of there to see. You really have to think about it, and you have to think about, as I said, the images in relation to one another and sort of holistically. And
yeah, I mean, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
That's right.
No, I mean, the images do a lot of work here, which is fascinating because usually, you know, I've also been interested in her work for so long, and you know, I, like you, have a couple monographs on the shelf and exhibition catalogs and things like that. And the images, either they're photographs of installations, which are fabulous, and they're treated in the exact same way that the graphic work is. And so there's always a slight remove. You know, you're not necessarily encouraged to read her print work as sort of a legible reading experience. You're just, it's there to be looked at. It might be reproduced small and it's next to a sculpture. And so this sort of move into, no, you have to read, you have to look and read at the same time, is very helpful in thinking about her entire career. And there are two related questions I wanted to ask you. One is, as you said, a great metaphor for her life is that she lived inside of one of her sculptures for a little while. But that very impulse also kind of kept her out of a lot of contemporary art history. She was widely collected, she's in the Menil and the Whitney and other museums, but there wasn't a major, in recent memory, there are just two major retrospectives, one just recently, a PS1, which sort of tried to rehabilitate her as a public-minded artist first, which is interesting, and then one at the Guggenheim Bilbao. But what do you think kind of kept her off of center stage? I mean, the fact is, until and then one at the Menil, actually. So there's been a bit of resurgence lately. So, what do you think accounts for the relative curatorial and institutional neglect, and then the recent sort of surge of interest, which your book is a part of?
He produced so much work and so much different work that I think it's hard to, I suspect it's very hard to mount an exhibition that really captures every aspect of it. I mean, it's a lot, not just in volume, but the diversity of it is really incredible. So I imagine that's a pretty big stumbling block. The PS1 show had a certain angle to it, and the show that it's at the Menil was from, it was a work of the her sculptures from the 60s, or work of the 60s, which the 60s were a huge period for her. So that alone is a huge subject. So I think that's part of it, but she also doesn't really fit in anywhere for much the same reason, I think. I can't think of a group to which she neatly belongs. I think that often she's thought of, as a monumental sculpture, which she is, but that's really just one facet of what she does. She made films and performance work, things for the stage. She made books. And not even all of that gets into this book because, for instance, a lot of the film stuff and the stage stuff, it wasn't represented in the kind of work that I was able to pull from. And it's been interesting too, seeing the kind of response to the PS1 show, which was, I think, really a revelation for a lot of people who didn't know her or didn't know her work very well. But the response seems roughly to divide her work into two stages. So there's like the early violent work, such as the tear, the shooting paintings, and then the nanas and everything that came after. But in truth, her body of work is far more nuanced than that. I mean, you can see the nanas coming much earlier than they did in the work that she started making right after the tear. I mean, she was doing these women, and they were witches and mothers and brides, and they were sort of reliefs, and she was using all different kinds of material. And they're not these happy, joyous figures that the nanas are. They're fraught. She's exploring these sort of different roles. And then even after she began making the nanas, her work isn't all joy, as I was saying before, that you can see her thinking about things like doubt and pain and cruelty. The image that's on the cover, the Tree of Life, is, that's sort of exactly it, right? There's one half are all of these positive things like love and friendship, books, art, and then on the black and white half are things like famine and injustice and things like that. And it's the reason that image is on the cover. It's such a perfect visual metaphor. And then, but if you look down at the bottom of the tree trunk, there's a figure there in a pink dress, which I think gets lost. Like you see the face in the middle, but there's the pink. And I mean, I think that it is her in a sense, and that this is the tree that has sprung up. And you see this reclining figure in some other works where it's, you know, it's a dream, right? This figure who's dreaming.
Yeah. She, as though she sort of dreamed this divided, complicated world.
Not even dreamed of it.
Dreamed of it, or
this is what sort of, you know, has sprung, right? This is what's coming out of her, you know, imagination and her brain and her creativity. And it manifests. And trees, you know, she says that she started drawing trees when she was still a schoolgirl, and she never stopped drawing trees.
Yeah, it's so interesting. She there's a sense, you're right, I mean, in the 60s in particular, she's really finding a form and different ways of expressing femininity and different kinds of female forms. And the nanas, in a way, I think are so key here, because that seemed to be the one form that she stayed with for years and years and years, and they kind of became synonymous with her. What do you make of those as sculptures now? I mean, I didn't see the Manil show. I don't know if you did.
No.
But those are incredibly powerful works as sculptures. And where do you place those in terms of her own ambition? And did she keep making them throughout her life? Was there a sort of end point for the nanas?
She did make them for a very long time. She also made a series called The Skinnies when she was having breathing problems later in life, because she had, you know, from the materials she had been using, she made these works called Skinnies, and they're still very colorful like the nanas, but they're essentially outlines of figures. And it was, you know, when she was able to literally breathe again, she made these to sort of you know, represent that the air, the sort of intake of air, and the I think being able to enjoy life again. And what I find so interesting about them is that, you know, they're the outline, so you can see through them. So, you know, wherever they're set, they're sort of they take in the environment around them in a way that feels a little bit like maybe the reverse or the obverse of the nanas, who are so, I mean, she called them, I love it, happy, what is it, domineering women. Joy's domineering women is what she called them. Which I think is interesting, because they're joyous, but they're domineering. They're not just these sort of pushovers.
No, and they, at first glance though, that they appear as though they're just sort of, you know, floating in space and joyous. The domineering part of it is so interesting, because it's such a huge part of her work, this sort of the duality there, which comes across in the book, but must have been tricky as a biographer to bring out that sort of both the sunny side of it and the whole rest of her, as with the nanas.
I mean, I think I lucked out in that she wrote a lot about the sort of conflicts and the contradictions. And, you know, that's one thing you get with a more traditional biography, where you bring in different sources that you can sort of see where those contradictions are. One person says one thing and somebody else says another, and you sort of find, you know, there's something interesting in the difference there. I don't have that, because it's only her voice in there, but she writes so much about her own interior feelings of, you know, these contradictions. I mean, there are literal works that are just one side of the pages, you know, I feel great about myself. Here are all the different things I think is cool about me. And the other is like, you know, I'm terrible. I'm, you know, awful. again, like the tree on the cover. So I think she was always working through these
Mhm.
conflicting feelings about herself. So, lucky me that she did that. And she did it quite a bit. And there were a number of works that I had never seen before that I don't think, have been published, that were in the archive that I got to put in there. There's a sequence where she talks about, for instance, the way that she wants to see herself and the way that she does see herself, the way that maybe other people see her. She says, I overvalue myself, I undervalue myself. So there's an interesting, she was, very expressive of that inner conflict. Makes for a great biography.
It does. It does. It also reminds me, and you mentioned this earlier, of autobiographical cartooning, which is something you've written and edited quite a bit of comics and about and edited comics. And I wondered sort of where you place her as a cartoonist of sorts, or do you, or how it might relate to autobiographical cartooning, which sort of, roughly comes up around 1970, 71. And has flourished in the last 15, 20 years.
I hadn't thought of her as a cartoonist, though, it's true that she does do these works that are that. I mean, and a lot of them are, trying to find one here. They're not, I don't think this one can be read, but this sort of thing,
Yeah.
they're not written in, they're not autobiographical. They're written about, like, they're made up stories.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them are signed with other names, and they're addressed to, like the Dear Diana, and she signs it Susan, right? There are these made up things, but she's working through different ideas of femininity, of women's roles.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you can see her thinking about aspects of her own life, the way she talks about her watching her mother put on makeup. And then she's got sort of a little narrative about, going shopping and putting on makeup. And I feel like she's sort of exploring all of these things, and how difficult it is too to be all these things for everyone, sort of the perfect, the lover and the cook and the shopper and the cleaner and the mother and all of this stuff.
Yeah.
That didn't really answer your question, but
That's okay. Before we turn it over to the audience, I have one more, which was, the book is dedicated to Maxine Grofsky. And I wondered if you could tell us why, and just why.
Maxine was the last Paris editor of the Paris Review. She ran the office from 1965 to 74. And she had met Niki and Harry actually before that in Westchester, I think. No, the Hamptons in like 1961. And actually she sort of between those times, Niki and Harry split, and she fell in love with Harry's writing. She was working at a publishing house, and she decided she was going to run away with him before she even met him. And they did run away, and they went to Paris, where she met Niki. And I mean, Maxine's whole story is an incredible who's who, though she's very modest in speaking about herself. So she was in charge of the production of the Paris Review in Paris, but she also found a number of artists and writers to publish there. She, Don Ashbery, James Schuyler, Joe Brainerd, and she put them in the magazine. Oh, John Cage, Jim Carroll. She's responsible for, so many writers of that period. She's the reason that Harry's novel, The Sinking of the Audrecht Stadium, was published in full in the magazine. And she published a piece by Niki, a Dear Diana, that unfortunately was published in black and white. So she was friends with Niki, and they stayed friends until Niki died in 2002. And I met Maxine when we did her Paris Review interview, which is a great read. I recommend it. This is around 2017. And I, was introduced to her specifically to say, because I knew that she had been friends with Niki, to say that I wanted to do this book. And she was so enthusiastic and supportive, and she made introductions for me. And telling Maxine, who is, this goddess, wonderful woman, telling her that I was going to do this meant that I had to do it. And I'm such a procrastinator, and I would put it off forever, but saying it to her made it real. And she's been such a wonderful supporter of me and my work in this book. And she was Niki's friend, and she's my friend. And I sort of feel, I don't know, in some way that she's this wonderful tether between us. So that's my
wonderful. Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna take some questions. Nell Painter asks, French handwriting differs from English handwriting. Does that difference influence did that difference influence your choices of writing and drawing that you included in the book?
No, she wrote a surprising amount in English, so it wasn't really an issue. I'm trying to think now what the different I had never thought about the French handwriting versus the English handwriting. They're both, she's got great handwriting. And she, and it's not just the sort of words that she illustrated. So this is what, this is in English. She's just got great handwriting.
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess luckily I didn't have to make that choice.
What you do. Thad asks, can you talk a little bit about the role that Harry Matthews, the American avant-garde writer, played in her life?
Sure. They were, they got married very young. She was 19, and he was studying. She says that his intellect is what really drew her to him. He was, a big reader, and he was studying music. He wanted to be a composer, and so they read a lot together, and they listened to music together, and they were, just sort of consumed culture and were supportive of each other. And they both rejected the family structures that they had grown up in, and wanted that, which is part of the reason that they moved to Europe. So they were very well suited to each other in that sense. And they were, he did, he took care of the kids, and he did the washing, and they sort of split all these responsibilities. When she wanted to take an art class, she went and took an art class. She immediately said that wasn't for her, but I think that they were mutually supportive, and he credits her with encouraging him to become a writer. He says that he saw her, doing that he saw her pursuing what she wanted to do, and took great inspiration from that. And, he was saying these things many years after they had split. In her second memoir, which is The Years with Harry, she invited him to make these sort of annotations, which she publishes alongside her main narrative. And he clarifies certain things. He contradicts her, gently. and he gives her often more credit that she gives herself.
Yeah.
So, even I think for the rest of their lives, they were very supportive of one another.
Another question. How do the sacrifices and hardships of her life show up in her artwork?
She talks about them. She writes a lot about them. The tear were sort of performative. I don't know what the right word is, like sort of an evocation of the pain and other sorts of things that she was feeling. And she says she shot to get these things out of her system, that she says it was great therapy. And I think that she was sort of less interested in the work that it made, the sort of painting that was produced, than in the performance of it, the shooting of it. So that's certainly one way that it shows up. There are, any number of reliefs and things early on where you can see them, where she, for instance, was embedding, this is actually before she was doing the shooting painting, she was doing these, when she was with the Nouveau Realistes, she embedded sharp objects into these reliefs, like knives and axes and saws. And she writes in her memoir when, she was feeling suicidal, and she stashed a bunch of knives and things under her bed, and she carried them in her purse. And she's making these works where she's putting the exact same sorts of objects into them.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of, later examples. I think later there's certainly less violence, but she still writes about having sort of, suicidal ideation for the rest of her life.
Yeah.
And certainly the physical pain that she experienced was really crippling.
Yeah. Another audience question. Did your approach to this book strike you as altogether satisfactory in the Skur tradition of allowing the subject's own work to speak for itself, or do you now long to write a conventional biography of any subject, not necessarily Niki, but just to sort of have that experience of moving through a life in a more conventional manner?
It is satisfactory. It's the book that I had envisioned, and I'm enormously happy with the way that it's turned out. I think it's successful in terms of what I wanted it to do. And I think it does give a sense of her that doesn't really exist anywhere else. Certainly anyone could come along and write a conventional biography of her, and it would be, fantastic. It would be fascinating. I don't want to be that person with her specifically. This is sort of the book that I wanted to do, and I'm really glad that it's there, so it can be in conversation with any other book that might come out. I do like thinking about other people's lives, and I do love archival work. So yes, I think that I will do something else, but maybe not a completely traditional book, maybe something a bit more traditional than this one.
Yeah.
See.
Yeah. Question from Claire Fentress. Let's see. We were talking about Niki living inside of one of her artworks for some time. And Nicole, you have in some ways been doing that same thing with this book. What does it feel like to be on the other side, for the book and this story to be in the world and out of your hands? You're out of it now.
Hi, Claire. It feels kind of weird, actually. But good. It is strange to spend so much time with a person and then feel like at some point you're just going to have to leave them behind and move on with other things.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think I've quite processed it yet. And I'm still, of course, talking about the book. So I haven't left it behind just yet. But it was, I think of all the different lives you could spend your time within. This one was wonderful. And I sort of feel a little guilty that it was such an easy job. I think I just enjoyed it. I love thinking about writing and images, and this was just perfect. And she's a wonderful, thoughtful, artist to spend time with.
Yeah. Another question. How did making this biography affect your sense of Niki's place in post-war art? Did the process for you reposition her in the history of art? Did it elevate her? Did it give you sort of a whole reconsideration of what she was doing?
It definitely deepened it. She's so often referred to as a pop artist, but it doesn't really fit. And spending so much time with all of her different works and really getting into what she was thinking about, she just doesn't fit in anywhere. So, I'm, I guess, not a firm believer in categories anyway. They can be convenient, but, often we talk about, in our history, we talk about movements and we name artists that fit within that movement, but oftentimes those artists don't really always make sense together. They're doing very different things. So I don't mind thinking of her outside of all of that. But it did help me understand that she just made an incredibly diverse body of work that would benefit from being discussed with, I think, like any number of other artists, depending on the period. I was just at the Faith Ringgold show at the New Museum, and Ringgold used images and text in her story quilts. So they're kind of, the two of them are kind of similar in that way. And, I think you could set her alongside any number of artists and it would be an interesting sort of conversation.
Yeah. Well, I think that's going to be our final question.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Nicole Rudick, and congratulations on this wonderful new book. I'm so glad to see it out in the world. We've been talking about it for some time, so it's really a thrill. I want to thank Kai Bird and the Leon Levy Center and Shelby White for her generous sponsorship of this event. Good night, everybody.